5 years on from the first lockdown, we are all still living in the world that COVID built and probably haven't come to terms with how much it has changed us. To begin, I just want to quickly ask everyone how the pandemic changed their lives, not lockdown experiences, but actually like permanent changes.
Well, I don't know. I was thinking about it when you asked us to think about it, and I don't know. It's I'm going to rephrase that.
That's very nice of you. Thank you so much. That's appreciated.
Oh, that was phrased very poorly, wasn't it? I'm just going to keep going like a little trooper I am. But no, and I think it's quite hard not to be slightly philosophical about that stuff, like kind of existential, in that I think, I think a lot about the stuff that probably would have happened if the pandemic hadn't, taken place. Like stuff like I was very much thinking quite seriously about moving to Brussels when the pandemic hit. And, would I have done it? Maybe. I did have the visa. I would have had the job. I had the connections, the friends, etc. So I think it's really weird to think there's a non-COVID Marie who's now, made a new life in Brussels and has been settled there for many years. But also paradoxically, I think that I probably would not have ended up going to live in like Venice for a few months and New York for a few months because, I got this sense when the pandemic ended of going, I just can't, like the world is really big and I actually want to experience a lot of it. So yes, I think it's mostly stuff that I guess didn't happen, which is weird.
Well, I had a baby during the first lockdown, so that's my second child. That's a pretty permanent change to my life. No, more seriously though, I did have a realisation during that whole period that I didn't need the sort of structure that having a permanent job gave me to have good mental health, and actually that it wasn't serving me well at all. In a lot of ways, it was taking away from me, away from my family, my children, but also from other things like being a long way from my community for most of the week. And I chose to go freelance after that. So I actually had a really weird scenario where I left the office in early February 2020, signed off with pregnancy-related illness, thought I was going to be off for 2 weeks maybe, and never went back to that office. And I've never been back since. And I've no idea what I left in the office drawer.
Wow, I hope it wasn't organic.
Yeah, so I think remote working is one. So now I do 2 days a week in the office, 3 at home, which it was unthinkable before. But for me, the biggest change has just been my career. I mean, it just made a sea change. I've never in my life worked as hard as I did those first 18 to 24 months. And I'd never done any media. It was all kind of just about, okay, well, what am I doing? How can I help? And I ended it with a very different profile to how I went into it. So from a personal point of view, that was a big change.
COVID, a land of contrast for you.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, so my work changed as well because I used to, for 20 odd years, I was doing quite a lot of music journalism and not just that, but I was, I'd, get travel around with bands and stuff. And then Q Magazine, my main employer, folded due to the pandemic, and there were essentially not quite, but almost no more trips because it was like, oh, you can do all your interviews on Zoom now. So I haven't been anywhere for work since the end of 2019, I think.
Aww.
Which is not. I'm just saying this is a thing. I'm not saying, oh, boo-hoo, why doesn't Dorian stay in the nice hotel anymore? But it was just a real sort of shift, and so now I do more podcasts and politics and so on. And then it also turns out, on the downside, that getting COVID very early on, pre-vaccine, like February 2020. Caused a breathing pattern disorder, which has recently been diagnosed, and I'm doing sort of exercises for. Oh. And I just hadn't really. I was like, why is my breathing so fucked up? and it was cheeky little COVID. Christina, let's start then with what COVID revealed about the British state. I mean, we're not going to do like a post-mortem here, but it did seem obviously ill-prepared and slow to act. It fared worse than anyone else in the G7 in terms of things like excess death and long-term illness. Were the weaknesses that were illuminated, have they improved in any way? Or is it just like, well, we're glad that's over?
No, they haven't improved, I think is the easy thing, the easy answer. There are some ways in which we're better prepared. We'd be better prepared to do vaccines next time. I think that story went really well, and we know how to collect that data, and the UK had some of the best data in the world. Acting on that data, we're not better prepared for. The NHS is much weaker than it was. Our population is sicker, like going back to the kind of benefit cuts. It's not just that more people are claiming it, it's more people are sick. right? And some of that is directly because of COVID, some of that's because the NHS couldn't cope and we have massive waiting lists. There's much less trust in government, which are going to make future public health measures much harder. Public health became woke in a way that I never thought I would see. And it's kind of become part of the culture war. So I think we're just not prepared to go into it. And what you see now, if people talk about it at all, and they really don't, the government does not want to talk about COVID, it's about lockdowns and the impact of lockdowns, not the impact of the pandemic or the impact of COVID or what we can learn from it. Because we're not doing anything to prepare for the next one. We're not improving ventilation. We're not ramping up our testing capabilities. We're not talking to other countries. Like all of those things that I would have been sure would happen just aren't happening.
And well, America, they seem to, the Republicans seem to have adopted a sort of pro-virus platform. And, exploiting this lack of trust in science. But there also seems a lack of trust between countries. Like we still, I'm absolutely not going to get into lab leak theories and so on. But there is certainly a lot of distrust, particularly of China, between countries. There's so is all of that. So it's not just trust within countries, but is it sort of trust sort of globally been shaken?
Well, this is where I think it's quite interesting, because I think there may be lack of trust between countries, but there isn't between countries' scientists. So the international collaborations during COVID multiplied, right? And I think those are still really strong. And there are loads of new international collaborations that are still ongoing of scientists trying to prepare for the next pandemic. And I would say within Europe, you have people like the European Observatory and the European Centres for Disease, and they are collaborating across countries. I'm not sure that it's this kind of useful thing that all countries just trust each other.
No, that's good. I'm glad that my glib generalisation was not accurate in that case. Marie, Trump's chaotic response probably cost him the 2020 election. We kind of forget now because he was just terrible in the first term, but he was sort of cruising to a re-election. And the Partygate helped to bring down Boris Johnson. If we're talking about different branches of history here, do you think if not for COVID, both leaders would have remained in office, and perhaps others like Bolsonaro and so on?
It's a really good question, and I don't know, and I'm going to answer a slightly different question. I know you love it when I do that. But no, so something I found really interesting.
Gods!
No, so when I was in the US before the last election, the 2024 one, what I found really interesting, and I did not expect at all, was how often COVID came up, and especially in floating voters or Republican voters, nearly all of them mentioned the pandemic. And that includes either people I met kind of in the street and stuff, but also the kind of root and branch like GOP operatives. And they kept talking about being, either mask mandates, people being told to stay at home, vaccines, on the kind of like nuttier end of things, etc. Like it came up again and again and again. So I think that Trump probably lost the election because of, at least partially because of COVID in 2020, but I think Joe Biden partially lost the election in 2024, weirdly because of COVID as well.
Well,
And I think Boris is slightly complicated because he's kind of his own thing of, I think Partygate obviously brought him down. No one disagrees with that. But equally, something else I suspect would have brought him down anyway, and something else probably of a similar nature.
Yes, because the final straw was not Partygate. It was Chris Pincher, was it?
It was.
And then there was Owen Paterson before then.
Yeah, so it was the kind of like sleaze gate. But no, so I think that the US was a very weird one. But, to actually answer your question, I wonder if the problem is not that there was always going to be around half of people, or at least, kind of a significant minority who would get furious at how whichever leader had handled the pandemic.
Well, you say that, that COVID probably cost Kamala Harris the election. And my daughter's doing politics A-level, and she was asking me about, the benefits of incumbency. And I was going, well, this question would have been very different a few years ago when I was doing politics A-level. It was, the huge advantages of incumbency. Last year, almost every incumbent either lost or saw a fall in support. So do you think that COVID and then the sort of subsequent inflation and the change in interest rates and all of these there were lots of different things and just creating general dissatisfaction because there's this weird thing that reported happiness is untethered from economic indicators. So things can be going quite well on paper, but people are just pissed off. Do you think that this has given us a new era where actually being an incumbent is kind of awful and that the voters are waiting to kick you out?
So briefly, I should say that I will note the irony of having had a Biden moment while talking about Joe Biden and not Kamala Harris. But no, so this question, I don't know. I think there's so many things at play. Like, I think part of it is, the incumbent effect does exist, but also it might just be the case that actually it was never like that immensely strong. And actually, and if you do get, for example, inflation, like high inflation, voters will feel so much more strongly about that kind of effect will get kicked to the ground. I think that partially, and I think that's something that a lot of politicians, I think, across the world have learned recently, which is that voters prefer unemployment to inflation if clearly made to pick between the two. Because I think a lot of policymaking assume that inflation would be better than high unemployment, especially with kind of like salaries, at least in the US, for example, kind of like rising. Not quite, keeping up with inflation, but not far. But actually, that's not the case at all. So I think it's probably too early to say. I know it's probably a slightly boring answer, but I think it's probably a bit too early to kind of put the incumbency effect in the coffin.
But it turns out the public are Thatcherites, and they prefer unemployment to inflation. One thing I find shocking is the thought that actually it would have been much better if Trump had won in 2020, even though at the time we'd have been like, oh, fucking hell, 2 terms. He would have been running out of steam. He'd have been more of a lame duck. He wouldn't have had time to kind of regroup and bring in this kind of absolute sort of, blitzkrieg savagery that he's doing now. Obviously, we wouldn't have had January the 6th. And it just seems like he'd have done the second term and then been out of the way, and that would have been, in the long run, better.
I don't disagree. I enjoyed the tweet, the Blue Sky post that said that the people around Trump first term were like the Batman villains in the 60s cartoons, and this time it's in the Batman gritty films, which I thought was,
So, Hannah, obviously the Tories were not very happy. People like Rishi Sunak and Treasury sidekick Kevin Badenoch did not like having to borrow vast amounts of money to hand out to the public not to work. That was not a very, very Tory thing to do. How much do you think COVID explains the kind of economic mess?
It is a factor in where we are economically. I mean, globally, it's a factor in where everyone is economically. We're not an outlier in having our own economic issues at the moment. And obviously that investment in social stability, which, I mean, Sunak can raise eyebrows in hindsight all he likes, but there wasn't really much choice other than providing some sort of social stability. It did have a cost, yes. But there was a quote in a Guardian piece from 2024 that I read in preparation for today, which stated that I thought was very, very astute. It said COVID was not just a political stress test, it was a series of impossible choices. And I think our strategy, yes, it wasn't very well thought through and we were poorly managed throughout, but I don't think that's just because of the Conservatives. I don't think any administration would necessarily clearly have made a better job of it. Yeah. And it was just brute luck or misfortune that it happened to be the Tories.
But it's like that thing of helping people in order to help people out and to get the economy running again, and then that causes inflation. And there were so many, then you go, okay, here's problems caused by lockdown, but then if you don't have lockdown, I mean, I know there are people who would disagree with this, but I think imagine if you didn't have lockdown, you would have a lot more people dying. I know what you mean about the impossible choices.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I don't think Labour would have done a better job, but other countries did do a better job, especially in East Asia. And one of the things that I still find most frustrating is that we somehow refuse to learn anything from South Korea or Taiwan or those countries. And their economies did better and they had far, far fewer people dying. And they didn't, like South Korea never had a national lockdown, right? It wasn't inevitable. And we had many more weeks warning than mainland Europe. We could have done something more and we didn't. So
I do think that one of the reasons that we suffered so specifically, though, wasn't necessarily about the nature of the strategy that we chose. And you're right that other countries did fare better. So we can, you can argue that we didn't choose the right one. But it was because of the impact of austerity that had preceded it. So we were in a particularly crap state going into it. Our NHS was underprepared for anything, let alone
that's definitely
a pandemic. And so things like the waiting list crisis, which we've talked about, and, the courts backlog, which has been a crisis afterwards because of the closures. That was because of deep weaknesses in our systems already, and almost any choices that we made around that would have been exacerbated by those weaknesses.
Yeah, I mean, and just to say, I think we weren't actually in a position to do the strategy save South Korea because we disinvested in a lot of our public health infrastructure.
I mean, what I would say about have we learned anything, which is kind of one of the questions that we're asking today, isn't it? You know, where are we now, 5 years on? Have we learned anything? I don't think we necessarily have, because we've talked at the beginning of the show about cuts to support systems for people and health, and we are rehashing elements of austerity, which have left us in the position that we were in at the beginning of COVID.
Well, it seems like cut, massive crisis, spend enormously because you have to. Phew, glad that's over. Cut. That's a complaint, not a manifesto.
Yeah, I will not be voting for you. Thank you so much.
Christina, some would say the vaccines were sort of a scientific miracle. The speed that they were developed and rolled out saved lives, enabled us to return to relative normality. But you got anti-vaxxer sentiment booming. There's a stat that UK suspicion of vaccines rose from 14% in January 2021 when they first arrived, and people were very happy about them, to 34% last summer. Obviously, you've got the American Health Department being run by RFK Jr. What happened? How did people turn against the vaccines that kind of enabled us to broadly, get through COVID?
I think it's all part of the rise of the disinformation space, and it's becoming easier and easier to spread and harder to combat in the way people are consuming media, particularly when people consume personalized media. Like, for instance, I get most of my news via Blue Sky and podcasts, and that means that I do curate my own news space, as does everyone else. And that means you are quite vulnerable to seeing only certain stories. And I think the problem with vaccines is that they're hard to understand. Like, I haven't done biology since I was 16, and on Indie Sage I would have to get the immunologist to explain it to me, and they would explain it to me, and I was like, I have no idea what those words meant. Can you just I don't know what a T cell is. I don't know what a B cell is. I don't know what an antigen is. Can you just try and explain it to me?
We did an episode of Origin Story on anti-vaxxers, and an epidemiologist posted about it, and he went, great episode. They haven't quite understood how vaccines work. And it was like, I knew it.
But it was
very nice, though.
I saw that, and I messaged you, and I said, I think that nuance would have been lost on people, because it was just some insane thing about a certain type of cell, and I was like, you just don't need to know that. But it is really scary, because it's so hard to debunk, because it can sound extremely authoritative. And then you have to go, well, that data doesn't really make sense, and they've misused this statistics, and they've mashed that statistic in. But by the time you've got there, people have gone and they've left somewhere else. And the problem is that anti-vax is a gateway into all the other conspiracy theories. And this happened to my sister's friend, who started off being anti-vax and is now pro-Trump, pro-Putin, thinks Trump won the last election, really pro-reform. Like, because of that, she ended up in that ecosystem on YouTube, and that's really scary.
I think this is more common than a lot of people who listen to this podcast and are interested in the issues that we talk about realise. And I think what happened is that we were in a really low information space for a while, because COVID was a new thing. Scientists didn't quite understand it themselves. There was a lot of early research. Messages were put out in order to kind of get the public.
And sometimes it seemed like a contradiction, because part of science is just like, we found out more and now we're going to change our advice. Yeah. That's how it's meant to work. It's not a plot.
Absolutely. But some people really, really struggled with that uncertainty. And what they leapt on was the certainty of misinformation, disinformation. I can kind of understand that emotional reaction, but the danger of it is huge.
And Musk did quite a similar journey on Twitter in front of everybody.
Well, Musk, it happened with him, it was partly because the lockdown, shut down a Tesla factory, and so it was affecting his sort of bottom line. But it happened with him. It happened with Russell Brand. We would just did a lot of research into conspiracy theories, and so many times the most prominent cases of radicalization, the real turning point was 2020.
Just briefly on the low information space, like one frustration I did have with politicians, and I can only speak really for like France and Britain and perhaps like the US to an extent. I don't really know what it was like in other places, but I think politicians really struggled as well with the kind of idea of a low information space where like information changes all the time and we have lots of maybes and no certainty, where I think politicians, that it's part of their job to sound very confident and assertive, whatever they're saying. When I think something, if they'd been able to be a bit more honest, and either occasion you go, listen, on this specific thing, we have no idea currently. Hopefully we'll know soon. We don't know yet. Or even stuff like actually, the back when they said, we definitely don't need masks, but do wipe your groceries. Being able to say, actually, it turns out that was completely wrong. We called that wrong because we didn't know, because, and I think that let the rot kind of spread, because then people were like, oh, well, so politicians lied. And it's a bit like, well, no, they did give contradictory advice, like 3 weeks, let's say, between, but that's because the science changed. It's not because they lied. But they never truly acknowledged that, I think, at least in the countries I followed, which I found really frustrating.
I do feel some massive sympathy for them, though, because honestly, part of their job at that time was reassurance, preventing the spread of fear. Fear can be a really dangerous, powerful emotion politically. When it can lead to social unrest, and they were trying to prevent.
Well, and uncertainty causes fear, so you don't want to go, well, we don't really know. I remember somebody I knew who would they would an Amazon package. They would leave it in another room, handle it with gloves, and leave it in another room. And then not open it for a day or two until all the virus had gone off it, and it was like. But if you just say, oh, we do, if the government just goes, we don't know, the outdoor thing turned out not to be necessary. The limits on how many walks you could take, but of course, uncertainty is one of the things that causes fear. So if you just come out and go, we actually don't know, but we're going to find out, we'll let you know. Like that's not a win either.
Oh, I just want to add one more thing on the vaccine and the disinformation space, is that there's a lot of money in it for scientists who go rogue. And I saw that in scientists that started off being quite reasonable, and you could see them get radicalized. And there's just so much money from right-wing think tanks that like, say, Malhotra, who now has, well over 1 million followers on X, is feted across the world and makes thousands every time he gives a speech, right? They earn far more than I would ever earn trying to tell the truth.
Well, how many conventional epidemiologists are appearing on Joe Rogan,
Yeah, none.
Marie, you're an expert on people going mad online. Other people, not you. No, but you're a very online person. So was it that there were a lot of people actually who had almost sort of not been vaccinated against on the internet, and they were lonely and bored and scared, and they couldn't log off? There's a really striking little stat about the German Querdenker movement, if I pronounce that right, which is this kind of weird kind of thing of like left and right and wellness, and it's politically it makes no sense. But one of the main things is the core of it was freelancers and small business owners who they lost their work and they didn't get government funding. So they were kind of bored and financially insecure and angry and online. So is that kind of what happened? There were just people who just couldn't log off.
Oh yeah, I think they just. Oh no, you should never drink from the computer hose if you've not worked your way up to it yet. Like, you'll just it'll end terribly.
Marie does very good workshops where you can build up your resistance to online.
Yeah, you just need to like microdose insane posts, like for a while, and then eventually you can consume them for a few hours every day, and then yeah. But I do think that that's genuinely a problem of people who'd not maybe been online that much, and I saw that in my mum a bit, and who thankfully has not gone insane or anything. But it was really interesting / slightly unpleasant to watch her go from someone who was never really online. Like, she was never obviously, I think her generation is the kind of edge case where you could decide to be online or decide to actually be like, no, too old for that, goodbye. And she'd definitely been the latter at first. But then during the pandemic, she lives alone. She owns a little shop, which obviously was closed during the lockdowns. And yeah, and it started, whenever I'd call her, she would start being like, oh, and by the way, did you know that? And, oh, I was just reading this thing. And none of it was true. Like, absolutely none of it was true. And I kept having to be like, okay, did you, and the problem is it was tedious. I had to be like, did you Google this? Like, where did you find it, etc. So I think that, she's just quite And she's not a stupid woman, but I do think she's quite gullible because she'd never, she would read newspapers otherwise or stuff like that, stuff where you assume that you can trust the sources. And she'd gone straight from that to Facebook or Instagram, whatever. And I think that part of her brain going, well, if I'm reading it somewhere and it has lots of likes and has been shared a lot, I'm assuming it's true. And luckily, I think my brother and I were there to be like, okay, let's maybe treat the internet completely differently. But if you don't have those people in your life, then yeah, that's probably how the spiral begins. But I think there's also... and we've touched on it a bit, but the conspiracy theory thinking of, oh, well, do your own research thing of, being like, no, nothing is true unless you've done your own research, you've read your links and your sources, etc. And I'm very much going to state the obvious here, but you're a lot more likely to end up doing that if you're just stuck in the house every day for 3 months and go, oh, but, they wanted me to believe that, but I found this and this and that. And
also,
we've all gone down
you find an
rabbit holes
online community where you can vent your anger. The most radicalized group I know in my broader social circle is DJs. Middle-aged DJs, because they lost all their work.
Yeah.
They lost all their work and they were kind of
So
furious.
I don't know why I found that so funny. I'm so sorry.
It's really quite depressing. The real sort of dance music heads I know, they're constantly going, we regret to inform you we found another one. So, I mean, it was a very politically heightened time in lots of ways. And Black Lives Matter, of course, which existed before, but it really erupted in summer 2020 after the killing of George Floyd. And there was a momentum to it which felt enormous, more than there had been around Ferguson and in 2015. And if you actually go back and read magazines and papers from that time, it wasn't just obviously a reaction to police violence. It was almost like a kind of very, very sudden racial reckoning. Where suddenly it was about like your magazines were suddenly just like, oh my God, we don't put enough black people on the cover. There were, art exhibitions being postponed because maybe they were, and they weren't actually racist, but maybe they might, you know what I mean? It was like this sort of hyper sort of sensitivity. Was that, do you think, a product of COVID? I'm not saying George Floyd died because of that, but the
reaction,
mood of it.
Yeah. Yes, because there's very clear evidence that Black and Asian communities in most Western nations were completely left behind in COVID. They were more likely to die. They were less served with decent information. In the UK, there were loads of micro examples of this around things like park closures in areas with dense housing and so on. And that anger, that it solidified and kind of ignited deep grievances, long-standing grievances. I think it was people were feeling it already, and then there was the kind of touch point of
Well, I mean, it was
George
almost the kind of the heightened pitch of the reaction to it from, white people, basically. It just seemed to be, I'd never seen something that was so, people look back, even very progressive people, and look at some of the decisions that were made there, not around the police violence bit, but in the broader thing. And we'll just go, oh, that was quite weird. Like, it was weird that we did that.
Mm. Is there maybe a resilience point to make where I think people became a lot less resilient during the pandemic because we had to use so much energy, mentally, physically, emotionally, etc., to deal with the global pandemic? So I think that, and I think everyone saw that at a personal level. So that whenever something happened, which in other circumstances we could have coped with better, I think suddenly that's the thing that made you explode. Like, I certainly remember no longer feeling resilient at all. Like, the slightest thing could make me cry or make me furious or make me... So I wonder if, if you see that on a global scale, if you add the internet, if you add underlying societal issues, etc., then I think, having lost that whole chunk of resilience.
I think we're still reckoning with that now. I think that, and we don't talk about it, and I think that's one of the reasons why talking about this right now is really, really important, that politics has completely moved on. And, that's got practical implications in terms of pandemic readiness if it was to reoccur. But actually, the kind of exhaustion, the lack of resilience that I think many of us are still recovering from, and maybe for a period of time, is no longer a kind of a discussion point. The kind of collective trauma that we're sitting with is no longer a discussion point.
Maybe also we don't understand quite how, I remember looking back at certain things that I thought, and they were a little bit mad. There were certainly things that I was just thinking not like dangerous or anything like that, but looking back, I'm just like, what was I thinking there? And so I think that some of those decisions that were made, when we look back at sort of politics, if you don't talk about COVID, you don't quite understand why there would have been this kind of, this sort of hysteria. Like it's like if you've suffered bereavement, and your friends know that you might be behaving quite weirdly and they give you a bit of space. And so it feels like a lot of this sort of stuff, and unfortunately some of it happened in that more progressive direction, where this hypersensitivity, which of course then feeds this, backlash. But there seems to be no understanding that some of these particularly kind of examples of, overreach were actually in a time of of sort of a collective madness.
I do kind of want to just support what you're saying, that basically minority ethnic populations in the UK were just completely and utterly fucked over by the pandemic in every possible way. You know, they're much more likely to be key workers. They couldn't stay home and stay safe. They're more likely to get COVID, more likely to get really ill from COVID, more likely to get long COVID, more likely to lose their income, less likely to have green spaces, less likely to have a good house, it was just all of it was just done in such a way that all of the existing inequalities were made much, much worse. And we never really reckoned with it. We've never really admitted it right from the beginning in SAGE papers. You can see they were warning about it, and we never really did anything.
And it's true that the national press haven't really covered that very much. You know, the only places I've seen that written are publications like Hyphen, which is aimed at British Muslims, and it's not part of the continual discussion of how we recovered from COVID.
Marie, just to finish this section, put very crudely, older people were more vulnerable to dying from COVID, and younger people had to sacrifice more to protect them. And I do remember people arguing, I mean, it's a real eye-opener if you go back and read some of the pieces written in like spring, summer 2020 about how everything must change, that there needed to be more generational fairness as a result. I don't see that there has been. Am I missing something? Has there been any kind of awareness of that, and perhaps the growing resentment among young people, which of course does manifest in a lot more young men moving to the far right? Still not, not majority, but it certainly hasn't helped.
I think you can arguably see it in young women going to the far left as well. I think that general sort of like furious resentment. And no, I think, it's not been addressed at all. And, and it's one of those weird things. I feel like, 'cause I'm 33 and I'm like, am I still counting myself as young people? I feel like I was in my 20s during the pandemic. Does that count? But certainly, I feel like we still can't afford to buy houses. People who've had kids are receiving very little support from the state, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to, we've talked about this on the podcast a number of times, but no, I didn't think there's been any sort of acknowledgement that actually so much was lost, and especially looking at kind of micro generations just below us as well, of people who had to spend part of the university in lockdown, which is not, university is about, studying, let's be honest, is at most like 20% of the point of university. Sorry to science people, I feel like that's a very not STEM
that
view.
was my university experience.
Okay, good. Okay, I studied journalism, so yeah, did I? But, or people, like teenagers who were at school, etc. Like, I do think those generations got completely screwed over. And it's just not really been acknowledged that there's no... So in the way that there's been some schemes in a few continental European countries, if you get... I can't remember exactly how much it is, something like 300 quid on your 18th birthday, to buy, and you can use it on books, cinema, like culture, but even dumb stuff like that. Britain, as far as I can tell, has done none of them. Like, that there's not been any acknowledgement that maybe, young people, again, who were a lot less likely to die or become seriously ill from COVID, should maybe get a nice little thank you, a nice little,
Marie would like a book token.
Please. I keep writing to care every day, and yet...